There's a special vulnerability that comes from depending on your neighbor for the inputs that make food production possible. When America discovered that Canada controlled critical links in the American food chain, agricultural policy became foreign policy in ways no one had anticipated. I've been studying agricultural policy and food security for decades, and I can tell you that the revelation of American agricultural dependence on Canada represents one of the most fundamental challenges to American strategic autonomy since the oil shocks of the 1970s. Not because the dependence was newly created, but because it was finally acknowledged by policymakers who had built their careers on the assumption that American agricultural dominance made food security a solved problem rather than an ongoing vulnerability. The public story, as it's been presented in agricultural policy debates, painted a picture of American farming strength and global food leadership. American agricultural exports feed millions around the world, American farming technology sets global standards, and American agricultural productivity remains the envy of developed nations. The narrative was designed to project strength and self-sufficiency in the most fundamental human requirement, the ability to produce enough food to feed your population. But the reality behind that narrative was far more complex and far more troubling for American food security planners. American agricultural productivity had become dependent on Canadian inputs in ways that made the entire system vulnerable to disruptions in cross-border relationships. Fertilizer production, grain processing capacity, and agricultural technology had all become integrated across borders in ways that made American food independence largely mythological. The psychological moment when this dependence became undeniable came during a series of agricultural security briefings where American officials were forced to map the actual flows of inputs required for American food production. When you trace fertilizer sources, processing capacity, and critical agricultural inputs back to their origins, the picture that emerges is of a food system that couldn't function without Canadian cooperation. Let me walk you through exactly how this dependence developed, because the mechanics reveal important truths about how modern agricultural systems actually function. Agricultural independence isn't just about having enough farmland or favorable climate conditions. It's about controlling the entire supply chain from inputs to processing to distribution. American agriculture had been optimized for efficiency rather than independence, and that optimization had created vulnerabilities that political rhetoric never acknowledged. The fertilizer sector provides the most striking example of this structural dependence. Modern agriculture is impossible without massive fertilizer inputs, and fertilizer production requires natural gas, potash, and industrial capacity that are heavily concentrated in Canada. American farmers had become dependent on Canadian fertilizer not as a matter of convenience, but as a matter of necessity. Alternative sources existed in theory, but accessing them would require infrastructure investments and supply chain restructuring that could take years to complete. When diplomatic tensions threatened the reliability of this integrated fertilizer supply, American agricultural officials discovered that substituting Canadian fertilizer with domestic or alternative foreign sources wasn't just expensive. In many cases, it was technically impossible without massive infrastructure investments that would fundamentally reshape American agricultural economics. Entire regions of American farmland literally couldn't produce food without Canadian fertilizer inputs, regardless of how much domestic agricultural capacity existed on paper. The grain processing sector revealed similar dependencies that contradicted public assumptions about American agricultural self-sufficiency. Canadian grain processing facilities had become so integrated into American food supply chains that many American food products couldn't be produced without Canadian processing capacity. Grain that was grown in American fields was shipped north for processing and then shipped south as finished food products because Canadian facilities offered capabilities that American infrastructure lacked. This integration worked beautifully when it was treated as a partnership between complementary agricultural systems. It became a strategic vulnerability when political rhetoric began treating agricultural relationships in terms of competition rather than cooperation. The moment American officials started talking about food independence in ways that ignored Canadian dependencies, they highlighted vulnerabilities they had preferred to minimize. Canadian officials understood this dynamic perfectly and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of threatening to cut off agricultural supplies, which would have been economically damaging for Canada as well as America, they simply began highlighting the importance of stable, cooperative relationships for maintaining food security. The message was clear without being confrontational. Food production requires agricultural stability, and agricultural stability requires mutual respect. What made this Canadian approach particularly effective was how it combined practical necessity with subtle leverage. American agricultural officials couldn't argue with the technical realities of fertilizer dependency and processing capacity limitations, and American political leaders couldn't ignore the implications of food security for domestic political stability. When food security becomes a political liability, policy priorities shift rapidly toward accommodation rather than confrontation. The broader implications of this agricultural dependence extended far beyond farming issues into fundamental questions about American strategic autonomy and national security. When your neighbor controls critical inputs for your food production system, that neighbor gains leverage over your domestic and international policies, whether they choose to exercise that leverage explicitly or not. Food security is national security, and national security depends on relationships that can be disrupted by political miscalculation. This leverage became visible in how American officials began approaching agricultural policy decisions that could affect Canadian interests. Trade disputes, environmental regulations, and agricultural subsidies were increasingly evaluated not just for their direct agricultural merits, but for their potential impact on Canadian cooperation in food production matters. When food security depends on maintaining stable relationships, those relationships become strategic priorities that constrain policy flexibility. The economic implications reached deep into American farming communities that had built their livelihoods around the assumption of agricultural independence. Farmers who had invested in specialized equipment, land, and techniques that depended on Canadian inputs discovered that their operations couldn't function independently of Canadian supply chains. The gap between political messaging about agricultural strength and agricultural reality created economic uncertainty that affected everything from crop planning to land values. From Canada's perspective, this recognition of American dependence created opportunities that Canadian agricultural leaders had never actively pursued but couldn't ignore once they became apparent. When your agricultural capacity becomes essential to your neighbor's food security, you gain influence over your neighbor's behavior, whether you want that influence or not. Canadian agricultural policy began reflecting this new understanding of Canada's strategic importance in North American food systems. Canadian agricultural investment started focusing on capabilities that complemented rather than competed with American production, but in ways that made Canadian cooperation more essential rather than less. Fertilizer production capacity expanded, grain processing capabilities improved, and agricultural technology development accelerated in areas where American systems had gaps that Canadian systems could fill. What's particularly striking about this transformation is how it revealed the gap between American political culture and American agricultural reality. Political leaders could talk about food independence and agricultural dominance, but farmers had to deal with the practical requirements of feeding America. When rhetoric and reality diverge so dramatically, agricultural policy becomes disconnected from agricultural needs. The international implications of American agricultural dependence on Canada extended far beyond bilateral relationships into global food politics. When other countries observed that American food independence was largely mythological, it affected how they approached their own food relationships with America. If America couldn't maintain food independence from its friendliest neighbor, how credible were American agricultural partnerships for countries that needed food security guarantees? This credibility gap became visible in how international agricultural partnerships were structured. Countries that had traditionally looked to America for agricultural technology and food security cooperation began developing alternative arrangements that didn't depend on American capacity to deliver food independence that America hadn't achieved for itself. When the food provider can't provide for itself independently, the provision becomes conditional rather than reliable. The technological dimension of American agricultural dependence on Canada is equally significant but less visible to the general public. Modern agriculture depends not just on land and climate, but on advanced fertilizers, processing equipment, and specialized agricultural inputs. Canada's dominance in fertilizer technology, grain processing innovation, and agricultural infrastructure development made American agricultural productivity dependent on Canadian technological capabilities in ways that political independence rhetoric never acknowledged. When political relationships affect access to these technological resources, agricultural independence becomes even more mythological. You can't maintain independent food production with dependent supply chains, and American food supply chains were deeply dependent on Canadian resources, technology, and capacity in ways that agricultural independence advocates never honestly addressed. The most sobering aspect of this entire revelation is how it demonstrates that food independence requires not just domestic agricultural capacity, but domestic political wisdom that prioritizes long-term food security over short-term political advantage. Food systems are built over decades and depend on stability that extends beyond electoral cycles. When political culture undermines that stability, it undermines food security regardless of domestic agricultural abundance. For American agricultural planners, the recognition of food dependence on Canada forced a fundamental recalibration of what agricultural independence actually means in practice. True food independence would require massive infrastructure investments, technological development, and supply chain restructuring that American agricultural economics had proven unable to support independently. The alternative was accepting dependence and managing it through stable relationships, rather than denying it through agricultural mythology. The food chain crisis reveals more than an agricultural policy failure. It reveals the consequences of building political identity around myths rather than realities. When food independence becomes a political slogan rather than a strategic objective, agricultural policy becomes disconnected from the infrastructure requirements that make independence possible. And when that disconnection becomes apparent, the political mythology collapses in ways that reshape food relationships across an entire continent. As this reality continues to sink in for American agricultural policymakers, what becomes clear is that North American food relationships have fundamentally shifted from American dominance to Canadian leverage. The country that spent decades assuming its agricultural strength made food security automatic has discovered that its food security has become conditional on maintaining good relationships with its northern neighbor. And once that shift in agricultural leverage is acknowledged, it can never be completely reversed, regardless of how much political rhetoric tries to wish away the fundamental infrastructure realities that created it.